Hi, I'm Margaret Foley. I'm a master's student at UWaterloo, and I'll be presenting my work, Comparing Smartphone Speech Recognition and Touchscreen Typing for Composition and Transcription, which I did with my supervisor, Dan Vogel, and with Géry Casiez. A few years ago, a study at Stanford compared typing and speech recognition for smartphones. Several websites found this study and used it to write some rather clickbaity articles. Evidently, these websites never read past the abstract, or they would have noticed that this study only tested transcription. And transcription is not representative of how we typically use mobile phones. Which begs the question, what happens when speech recognition and touch-based keyboards are compared for a phrase composition task? Transcription is, by and large, the de facto task for text entry evaluations, and for good reason. It has high internal validity. The correct version of a sentence is already known beforehand, which makes calculating error rates easy. In contrast, composition is a much more variable task. No two people will compose the same sentence given a certain stimulus. How do you determine what the correct version of a sentence is? Ruan and Christensen found that the variability inherent in composition tasks can be controlled enough to evaluate text entry. And several studies have compared typing and speech with a composition task. However, the studies I found are all over 10 years old at least, and used outdated speech recognition technologies. Only one of these studies examined input on a mobile phone, using a T9 keypad. In general, studies comparing these forms of input have found that speech is faster than typing. We hypothesized that speech would be slower and more error-prone for composition tasks. As when you use speech for composition, you have to think of the entire phrase before you begin input. And unlike when typing, you can't pivot midway through a sentence. Speech may also be more error-prone because you can't easily correct errors mid-input. You need to wait until you're finished talking before you can go back and fix errors. Our other hypotheses are directly taken from the Stanford study, to see if we could have similar findings to them. Our composition task was quite simple. Participants are presented with 3 clip art images like the example you see here. We refer to these as image triads. Participants are asked to compose a short phrase incorporating these images that was coherent and grammatically correct. Here are some examples of phrases participants came up with for this triad. As you can see, this form of stimulus still leaves room for participants to be creative with their compositions, but it gives structure to their compositions. Here are some more examples of image triads we used in our experiment. Now, instead of showing the same set of triads for both input conditions, we had a second set of similar but different images, like these. We used this because while we needed to be able to compare compositions between input methods, we were worried that participants might remember an image triad from previous conditions and reuse a composition. For our transcription task, instead of just selecting a random number of phrases from a well-known phrase set, we had participants transcribe their own compositions and phrases from a common pool from the first 11 participants. Our study used a 2x2 within subject design. Participants did 2 tasks with 2 input methods. The study was split into 2 sessions. Participants first completed the composition task, and then the transcription task in another session, at least a day later, to ensure fatigue concerns weren't an issue. In each session, they would compose or transcribe 20 phrases with each input method. We also had participants complete the TLX questionnaire after completing an entry method to evaluate subjective measures like how frustrating the task was. In total, we recruited 28 participants. All participants in our study had to be fluent in English. If English is not a participant's first language, they had to have a TOEFL score of 110 or higher, or an equivalent score in a similar assessment. As for measures, we had our time-related measures, like input time and prep time, which was the time from when participants first saw a stimulus to when they began input. For error rates, we measured how many errors went corrected and uncorrected during input, And we had our subjective measures, such as TLX scores, participant preferences, as well as any comments they made during the experiment. Now for results. We found that speech is far faster than typing for both transcription and composition. However, if you look at graph A, you'll notice that speech requires more preparation time than typing for both composition and transcription. Essentially, this means that for both tasks, participants had to think more before beginning input with speech. For error rates, we found that keyboard has a higher corrected error rate for composition. And while it had a higher corrected error rate for transcription, we didn't find this difference to be statistically significant. As for our uncorrected error rate results, you'll notice that all the bars are below 1%, which means that these results are too low to really be of note. For the TLX scores, for the transcription task, speech outperformed keyboard for every single metric. While keyboard had better TLX scores for some measures for the composition task, we didn't find a significant main effective input there. For user preferences, unsurprisingly for transcription, all participants preferred speech. However, for composition, a slight majority of participants actually preferred using the keyboard. Participants noted that they felt awkward with using speech. Even when it was just me and them alone in a room, some noted they still felt awkward composing short phrases in front of another person. And even people who said that they liked using speech had privacy concerns, with some people saying that, this is fast and very efficient, but I wouldn't want to use speech input in a public place or when I'm saying personal things. So, for our conclusions, for composition and transcription, speech is faster. However, participants do not greatly prefer speech recognition with a composition task. There are two avenues for future work that we'd like to examine. The first is comparison with previous work. As I previously mentioned, a paper by Virtanen and Christensen found that composition can be used for text entry evaluation. In this work, they also suggest a prompt for use in composition tasks. The obvious question is, how does this prompt compare with our own task? It would be interesting to examine whether this prompt is potentially a bit too open-ended or possibly biased towards recall, as it tells participants to think about things they often write about on their own mobile devices. Another avenue is to examine longer composition tasks, such as creative prompts, explanatory prompts, and showing participants more triads. Does speech lose its advantage when there's more input? After all, it's one thing for speech to be more efficient for short sentences. But what happens when you have to input punctuation? And how do you correct errors when there are multiple phrases of input you need to look over? Finally, how does creativity affect results? A person with experience in improv or debate might be better at thinking of things on the fly and have an easier time with composition tasks. From experience during the experiment, there were definitely some participants who had a lot of trouble with composition tasks. But that raises the question of how do you quantify and assess creativity? And how do you do it in a time-efficient manner? In summary, speech is very efficient, but people aren't likely to make it their primary form of input on their phones anytime soon. Thank you for listening to my talk.